Thomas Whitmore had always been different from other people. While most folks lived in crowded cities with their phones and cars, he chose the mountains. For 15 long years, his small wooden cabin deep in the Colorado Rockies had been his whole world. The nearest neighbor was 20 miles away, and that's exactly how Thomas liked it. Every morning, he woke up to the sound of wind through pine trees instead of traffic. He chopped his own wood, grew his own vegetables, and caught fish from the crystal-clear stream that ran behind his property. When winter came, Thomas was ready. He had enough stored food to last months, and his thick beard and weathered hands showed he wasn't afraid of hard work. The mountain animals knew him well. Deer would sometimes graze near his cabin, and he'd watch them through his kitchen window while drinking his morning coffee. Thomas had learned to live with nature, not fight against it. He hunted only what he needed to survive, and he always followed the rules about where he could and couldn't hunt. His property line was clearly marked. Thomas had walked those boundaries hundreds of times over the years. He knew every tree, every rock, every stream that marked where his land ended and the federal park began. When he hunted, he made sure to stay well within his own property. It was important to him to do things the right way. That Tuesday morning started like any other. Thomas was splitting firewood behind his cabin when he heard the rumble of engines coming up the mountain road. This was strange because hardly anyone came up here, especially not with multiple vehicles. He set down his axe and walked around to the front of his cabin. 3 government trucks were making their way up the steep dirt road that led to his home. Thomas felt his stomach tighten. In all his years on the mountain, he'd never had this many officials visit at once. Usually, if someone needed to check on something, it was just one park ranger stopping by to say hello. The trucks stopped in front of his cabin, and 6 men got out. They wore the dark green uniforms of federal park rangers, but these weren't the friendly rangers Thomas sometimes saw during fire season. These men looked serious, almost angry. Their leader was a tall, thin man with cold eyes and a badge that caught the morning sunlight. "Thomas Whitmore?" the leader called out. "That's me," Thomas replied, wiping sawdust from his hands on his worn jeans. "What can I do for you, gentlemen?" Instead of answering, the ranger held up an official-looking paper. "We have a warrant to search your property. You're being investigated for illegal hunting on federal land." Thomas felt like someone had punched him in the stomach. There must be some mistake. "I only hunt on my own property. I've been careful about that for 15 years. "We'll see about that," the ranger said coldly. "Step aside." The other rangers spread out around Thomas's cabin like they were surrounding a dangerous criminal. 2 of them went to check his small shed where he kept his tools. Another 2 went around back where he cleaned fish and prepared game. The leader and 1 other ranger pushed past Thomas into his cabin. Thomas followed them inside, his heart pounding. These men were going through his home like he was some kind of criminal. They opened his cabinets, looked in his closets, and even checked under his bed. The leader went straight to Thomas's old refrigerator and pulled it open. Well, the ranger said with a mean smile. "What do we have here?" Inside the refrigerator was elk meat that Thomas had prepared just 2 days earlier. It was neatly wrapped in brown paper and stored properly, just like Thomas always did with his hunting kills. He took pride in using every part of the animals he hunted and never wasting anything. "I shot that elk on my property," Thomas said quickly. "Check the date on the package." "I wrote it down like I always do." The ranger ignored him and called to his partner. "Get photos of this. And check his rifle." One of the rangers picked up Thomas's hunting rifle from where it hung above the fireplace. It was an old rifle that had belonged to his father, well maintained but showing its age. The ranger smelled the barrel and nodded to his boss. "Recently fired," he announced. "Of course it was recently fired," Thomas said, starting to get frustrated. "I used it to hunt that elk. On my own land where I have every right to hunt." The lead ranger turned to face Thomas with that same cold smile. "The problem, Mr. Whitmore, is that we have evidence you killed that elk on federal park land. That's a serious crime." Thomas couldn't believe what he was hearing. "That's impossible. I know my property lines better than anyone. I've walked them 1,000 times, have you now?" the ranger said, pulling out a map. "Because our survey shows you've been hunting well into protected federal land. That elk was killed at least half a mile inside the park boundary." Thomas looked at the map and his heart sank. The boundaries shown on this official map were different from what he'd always believed. According to this paper, his property was much smaller than he thought, and the area where he'd been hunting for years was actually part of the national park. "This can't be right," Thomas said, his voice shaking. "I've had my land surveyed. I have the official papers. Well, your papers are wrong, the ranger said, folding up the map. And hunting elk on federal land without a permit is a federal crime. We're placing you under arrest. The words hit Thomas like a physical blow. In all his years of living quietly on the mountain, he'd never been in trouble with the law. He paid his taxes, minded his own business, and tried to live right. Now these men were telling him he was a criminal. Can I at least get my coat? Thomas asked as one of the rangers pulled out handcuffs. You should have thought about that before you decided to break federal law, the lead ranger said. The cold metal handcuffs clicked around Thomas's wrists behind his back. He looked around his small cabin one last time, wondering when he'd see it again. The morning fire he'd built was still crackling in the fireplace. His coffee cup sat half full on the kitchen table. Everything looked normal, but nothing would ever be the same. As they led him outside, Thomas saw his neighbors, the Hendersons, standing by their own truck at the bottom of his driveway. Word traveled fast in these mountains, even with houses so far apart. Mrs. Henderson had her hand over her mouth, and her husband just stood there shaking his head. The rangers put Thomas in the back of one of their trucks like a common criminal. Through the window, he watched his cabin get smaller as they drove down the mountain. The trees that had been his friends for 15 years now looked like they were saying goodbye. During the long ride to town, Thomas tried to understand what had happened. He'd been so careful about hunting only on his own land. He'd been proud of following the rules and living the right way. How could the boundaries be so wrong? How could he have made such a big mistake without knowing it? The truck bounced over rocks and potholes on the mountain road, and with each bump, Thomas felt his old life getting further away. By the time they reached the county jail, he realized that everything he'd built on the mountain might be lost forever. His simple, peaceful life was over, and he didn't even understand why. 3 weeks after his arrest, Thomas sat in the county jail wearing an orange jumpsuit that was too big for him. The fluorescent lights buzzed constantly, and the concrete walls made everything feel cold and dead. He missed the sound of wind in the trees more than he'd ever missed anything in his life. His court-appointed lawyer, Mr. Peterson, had visited him only twice. Both times, the young man seemed more interested in checking his phone than listening to Thomas's story. Peterson had already told him the bad news. The evidence looked strong, and Thomas would probably go to prison for several years. The best I can do is try to get you a plea deal, Peterson had said during their last meeting. Maybe 5 years instead of 10 if you admit guilt. But Thomas couldn't admit to something he didn't believe he'd done. Even if the map showed his hunting spot was in the park, he'd been hunting there for 15 years without anyone telling him it was wrong. Didn't that count for something? The morning of his arraignment, Thomas was led into the courthouse in handcuffs and leg chains. The building was old but grand, with high ceilings and wooden benches that reminded him of a church. He'd never been in a courtroom before, and everything felt overwhelming. Peterson was already there, shuffling through papers and looking tired. He barely looked up when Thomas sat down beside him at the defendant's table. The prosecution's table was full of official-looking people in expensive suits, all of them seeming very confident about their case. "All rise," called the bailiff, the Honorable Judge Martinez presiding. Everyone in the courtroom stood as the judge entered. She was a middle-aged woman with kind eyes but a serious expression. Thomas hoped she might be willing to listen to his side of the story, but Peterson had warned him not to get his hopes up. The courtroom was mostly empty. A few reporters sat in the back, probably covering the case because it involved federal land. Thomas felt alone in a way he'd never felt before. Even during all those years by himself on the mountain, at least there he'd chosen to be alone. Judge Martinez looked over some papers and then began reading the charges against Thomas. Her voice echoed in the big room as she listed all the legal terms Thomas didn't fully understand. Federal this, criminal that, years in prison, thousands in fines. Each word felt like another nail in his coffin. "How does the defendant plead?" the judge asked. Peterson started to stand up, but before he could speak, the courtroom doors opened with a loud creak. Everyone turned to see who was coming in so late. Thomas turned too, curious despite his own troubles. A woman walked into the courtroom, and she was unlike anyone Thomas had ever seen. She wore a dark blue business suit that probably cost more than Thomas spent in a whole year. Her shoes clicked on the wooden floor, and she carried herself with the kind of confidence that came from success and money. But what struck Thomas most wasn't her expensive clothes or perfect appearance. It was the way she looked directly at him as she walked down the aisle between the benches. Her eyes were intelligent and determined, like she was studying him, trying to figure something out. She was maybe 40 years old, with dark hair pulled back neatly and the kind of smooth skin that came from good living. Everything about her said she came from a completely different world than Thomas's mountain cabin. Yet something in her expression seemed familiar, though Thomas was sure he'd never seen her before. The woman chose a seat in the third row, right behind where Thomas sat. He could feel her watching him as the judge continued with the proceedings. It made him nervous and curious at the same time. Who was she and why was she here? Peterson leaned over and whispered, "Do you know that woman?" Thomas shook his head. "Never seen her before in my life." But even as he said it, Thomas kept glancing back at her. She sat perfectly still, her hands folded in her lap, but her eyes never left him. There was something intense about her attention, like she was trying to solve a puzzle and he was the missing piece. "Mr. Peterson," Judge Martinez said, "how does your client plead to these charges?" Peterson stood up slowly. "Your Honor, my client pleads not guilty to all charges." The judge nodded and began discussing dates for the trial. Thomas tried to focus on what she was saying, but he kept thinking about the mysterious woman behind him. Why would someone dressed like that come to watch his case? He was nobody special, just a mountain man who might have made a terrible mistake about property lines. During a break in the proceedings, Thomas turned around to look at her again. She was still watching him, but now she seemed to be thinking hard about something. When their eyes met, she didn't look away like most people would. Instead, she nodded slightly like she was greeting an old friend. "All right," Judge Martinez said, bringing Thomas's attention back to the front. "Trial is set for 6 weeks from today. Mr. Peterson, I trust you'll use that time to prepare your case thoroughly." Peterson nodded, though Thomas could tell his lawyer wasn't planning to do much preparing. The young man seemed to think the case was already lost. As the judge left and people started filing out of the courtroom, Thomas was handcuffed again for the trip back to jail. But before the bailiff could lead him away, the woman in the expensive suit approached Peterson. "Excuse me," she said in a voice that was cultured but not snobbish. "Are you representing Mr. Whitmore?" "Yes, ma'am," Peterson replied, looking confused. "Are you a family member?" "Not exactly," she said, glancing at Thomas. "But I'd like to discuss his case with you. I may be able to help." Thomas wanted to ask her who she was and why she wanted to help, but the bailiff was already pulling him toward the door that led back to the jail cells. As he was led away, he heard the woman give Peterson her name and phone number. "Victoria Ashford," she said. "Please call me as soon as possible. I think there are things about Mr. Whitmore's situation that you don't know." Victoria Ashford. Thomas had never heard the name before, but somehow it seemed to fit her perfectly. As the jail door clanged shut behind him, Thomas couldn't stop thinking about her. Who was Victoria Ashford? And what did she think she knew about his situation? Back in his cell, Thomas lay on the thin mattress and stared at the ceiling. For the first time since his arrest, he felt a tiny spark of something that might have been hope. A stranger had come to his courtroom, someone who clearly had money and influence. She'd looked at him like she saw something worth saving. Thomas had been alone for so long that he'd forgotten what it felt like to have someone care about what happened to him, even if he didn't understand why Victoria Ashford was interested in helping him. Just knowing that someone was paying attention made the jail cell feel a little less lonely. Maybe, just maybe, his story wasn't over yet. Maybe there was still a chance to get back to his mountain cabin and his simple, peaceful life. And maybe, somehow, Victoria Ashford held the key to making that happen. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, but for the first time in weeks, Thomas fell asleep thinking about something other than prison bars and concrete walls. He thought about intelligent eyes and expensive suits and the possibility that even a man who'd lived alone for 15 years might not be as alone as he thought. The next morning, Thomas was surprised when a guard came to get him from his cell. "Your lawyer wants to see you," the guard said. "Emergency meeting." This was strange because Peterson had just seen him yesterday at court, and he'd seemed eager to leave. Thomas followed the guard to the small meeting room where lawyers met with their clients. Peterson was already there, but he wasn't alone. Sitting across from Peterson was Victoria Ashford, the mysterious woman from the courtroom. In the harsh fluorescent light of the jail meeting room, she looked even more out of place than she had in court. Her business suit was perfectly pressed and she smelled like expensive perfume, a sharp contrast to the disinfectant smell that filled every corner of the jail. "Thomas," Peterson said, looking confused and a little overwhelmed. "This is Victoria Ashford. She says she knows you." Thomas sat down carefully, the chains around his ankles clanking against the metal chair. "Ma'am, I think there's been some mistake. I don't believe we've ever met." Victoria studied his face for a long moment, then smiled slightly. "We haven't met recently, Thomas. But we did meet once many years ago." In Alaska, Thomas frowned. He had been to Alaska once, about 20 years ago, when he was much younger. He'd gone there looking for work in the oil fields, but it hadn't worked out, and he'd come back to Colorado after just a few months. He'd mostly kept to himself during that time and couldn't remember meeting anyone who looked like this successful businesswoman. "I'm sorry, but I don't remember," Thomas said honestly. "That's all right," Victoria replied. "It was a long time ago and we were both very different people then. But the important thing is that we knew each other well enough to be considered common law, married under Alaska state law." Peterson nearly choked on his coffee. "Common law married? You never mentioned being married, Thomas." Thomas felt like the room was spinning. "Because I'm not married. I've never been married to anyone." Victoria reached into her expensive leather briefcase and pulled out a folder. "I have documentation that proves otherwise. Photos, witness statements, rental agreements showing we lived together. Under Alaska law, if two people live together as husband and wife for a certain period and present themselves as married to the community, they are considered legally married even without a ceremony." She spread several photos across the table. Thomas leaned forward to look at them, his heart pounding. The photos showed a much younger version of himself with a woman who looked like Victoria might have looked 20 years ago. But the woman in the photos had different hair and was dressed in work clothes, not business suits. "That's not," Thomas started to say, then stopped. Looking closer at the photos, he felt a strange flicker of memory. There had been a woman in Alaska, someone he'd shared a small apartment with for a few weeks. But she'd looked so different then, and they'd both been struggling just to get by. "You remember now, don't you?" Victoria said quietly. "I went by Vicky then, not Victoria. I was working 2 jobs trying to save money for college. You were working on a fishing boat when you could find work." Thomas stared at the photos and suddenly the memories came flooding back. Vicky had been kind to him during a very difficult time in his life. They'd helped each other survive in a harsh place where everything was expensive and work was hard to find. She'd been saving every penny to get out of Alaska and build a better life for herself. "Vicky," he said softly, "you look so different now." 20 years and a lot of hard work will do that to a person," she replied. "I got my college degree, then my MBA. I built a successful consulting business in Denver, but I never forgot the months we spent together in Anchorage." Peterson was frantically taking notes. "If you two were common law married in Alaska and never officially divorced, then technically you're still married. That changes everything about this case." "How does it change anything?" Thomas asked. Victoria leaned forward, her eyes intense. "Because as your wife, I have the right to hire you proper legal representation. The best criminal defense attorney in Colorado works for my company. His name is Bill Morrison, and he's never lost a federal case." Thomas felt overwhelmed. This morning he'd been facing years in prison with an overworked public defender. Now this woman from his past was claiming they were married and offering to hire him a top lawyer. It felt too good to be true. "Why would you do this?" Thomas asked. "We barely knew each other 20 years ago." Victoria was quiet for a moment, then she spoke carefully. "Because I've been following your case in the news and something about it reminded me of you. When I saw you in that courtroom yesterday, sitting there all alone, it broke my heart. Nobody should have to face something like this without help." She paused, then continued. "And because those months in Alaska meant more to me than you might realize. You were kind to me when I had nothing. You shared what little food you had. You never asked for anything in return. I never forgot that." Thomas tried to process what she was telling him. He remembered Vicky as a hard-working young woman who'd been determined to build a better life. Looking at Victoria now, it was clear she'd succeeded beyond anything either of them could have imagined back then. "But this common law marriage thing," Thomas said, "are you sure it's real?" Victoria nodded. "I had my lawyers research it thoroughly before I came here. We lived together. We shared expenses, and Mrs. Patterson from downstairs always referred to us as a married couple. That's enough under Alaska law." Peterson was looking through the documents Victoria had brought. "This all looks legitimate. Thomas, if you agree to let Ms. Ashford hire Mr. Morrison to represent you, your chances of winning this case increase dramatically. Thomas looked at Victoria, trying to understand what was happening. What do you get out of this? You're obviously successful. You don't need anything from me. Maybe I just want to help someone who was kind to me once, Victoria said. Or maybe I believe that good people shouldn't go to prison for honest mistakes. The room was quiet except for the humming of the fluorescent lights overhead. Thomas had spent 15 years making his own decisions, living by his own rules. Now his future depended on trusting this woman he barely remembered. There's just one thing, Victoria added. If we're going to claim we're married, we need to be consistent about it. That means I'll be involved in your case, attending court hearings, meeting with your lawyer. People will expect us to act like we know each other well. Thomas understood what she was asking. They would have to pretend to be a couple, at least in public. It felt dishonest, but then again, maybe they really had been married under Alaska law, and what choice did he have? Stay with Peterson and probably go to prison? Or trust this woman and have a real chance at freedom? All right, Thomas said finally. If you're willing to help me, I'm grateful to accept. Victoria smiled, and for a moment Thomas could see traces of the young woman he'd known in Alaska. Good. Mr. Morrison will be here this afternoon to meet with you and start preparing your defense. As Victoria packed up her documents, Thomas felt something he hadn't felt in weeks. Hope. This woman had come out of nowhere to help him, claiming a connection from 20 years ago. Whether their marriage was real or not, her offer of help was genuine. Victoria, Thomas said as she prepared to leave. Thank you. I don't know why you're doing this, but thank you. She paused at the door and looked back at him. Everyone deserves someone in their corner, Thomas. Even mountain men who prefer to live alone. After she left, Thomas sat in the meeting room for a few more minutes, trying to understand what had just happened. His life had taken another unexpected turn, but this time it might be a turn toward hope instead of despair. That afternoon, Thomas met his new lawyer, and the difference was like night and day. Bill Morrison was a man in his 50s with silver hair and the kind of presence that commanded respect. When he walked into the jail meeting room, even the guard seemed to straighten up. Mr. Whitmore, Morrison said, extending his hand for a firm handshake. I've been looking forward to meeting you. Victoria has told me quite a bit about your situation. Morrison opened a leather briefcase that looked more expensive than anything Thomas had ever owned. Inside were neat stacks of legal documents, photographs, and maps. This lawyer had clearly done more preparation in one day than Peterson had done in 3 weeks. First things first, Morrison said. I want you to tell me exactly what happened from the beginning. Don't leave out any details, no matter how small they might seem. Thomas told his story again, but this time he felt like someone was actually listening. Morrison asked smart questions about the property lines, the hunting permits, and even details about Thomas's daily routine. He took careful notes and nodded thoughtfully at Thomas's answers. Now, Morrison said, tell me about your property. How long have you owned it? Do you have the original deed and survey documents? Thomas explained that he'd bought the land 15 years ago from an old man who was moving to town to live with his daughter. He gave me all the paperwork, including a survey map that showed exactly where my property ended and the federal land began. I've followed that map all these years. Where are those documents now? Morrison asked. In a fireproof box in my cabin. The rangers didn't take them because they said the government survey was the only one that mattered. Morrison made more notes. We need to get those documents. I'm also going to hire an independent surveyor to check the property lines. Something doesn't add up about this case. Over the next hour, Morrison explained what he'd already discovered. The park ranger who arrested Thomas, a man named Dave Collins, had been with the Park Service for only 2 years. Before that, he'd worked for a private security company and had no experience with land surveys or hunting regulations. That's interesting, Morrison said, because the survey map they're using to prosecute you was signed off on by Collins. Even though he's not qualified to verify boundary markers, Thomas felt a spark of hope. So the map might be wrong? It's possible. But even if the map is wrong, we need to prove it. That's going to take time and money for expert witnesses. Morrison closed his briefcase and looked directly at Thomas. I want to be honest with you about something. This case is going to be expensive. A full defense with expert witnesses, private surveyors, and all the investigation work could cost over $100,000. Thomas felt his hope deflating. I don't have that kind of money. I live off the land and barely use cash for anything. I know, Morrison said with a slight smile. But your wife does. The word wife still sounded strange to Thomas, but he was beginning to understand how much Victoria was risking to help him. She's really willing to spend that much on my defense? She's already approved it. Thomas, I don't know what happened between you two in Alaska, but that woman is completely committed to proving your innocence. The next day, Victoria came to visit Thomas at the jail. She looked different this time, wearing jeans and a simple sweater instead of her business suit. Somehow she seemed more like the Vicky he remembered from 20 years ago. I brought you something, she said, pulling out a thick folder. I've been researching everything I could find about your case in that area where you were hunting. Inside the folder were maps, newspaper articles, and even old photographs of the mountain region where Thomas lived. Victoria had been incredibly thorough, finding information that went back decades. Look at this, she said, pointing to a newspaper article from 10 years ago. There was a dispute about the park boundaries in your area. Some private landowners claimed the government had expanded the park onto their property without proper notification. Thomas studied the article. What happened to those people? Most of them sold their land to the government, rather than fight in court. But a few held out, and eventually the boundaries were redrawn to give them back some of their property. Victoria pulled out another document. And here's something interesting. The surveyor who did the original boundary marking in your area was later found to have made errors in several other locations. His license was suspended. Thomas looked at all the research Victoria had done, and he felt amazed. You did all this in just 2 days? I couldn't sleep, Victoria admitted. I kept thinking about you sitting in that jail cell for something you might not have done. I have resources, Thomas. Money, connections, people who can find information quickly. It seemed wrong not to use those things to help you. Over the next few weeks, Victoria visited Thomas almost every day. Sometimes she brought more research about his case. Other times she just came to talk. Thomas found himself looking forward to these visits more than anything else in his day. During one visit, Victoria told him more about her life since Alaska. After I left Anchorage, I was so focused on success that I barely had time for relationships. I built my business, bought a nice house in Denver, traveled all over the world, but I was always alone. Doesn't sound like a bad life, Thomas said. It wasn't bad, but it wasn't complete either. I had everything I thought I wanted, but I didn't have anyone to share it with. She paused, then looked at him carefully. When I saw you in that courtroom, sitting there all alone, it reminded me that some of the most genuine people I've ever known were the ones who had the least. Meanwhile, Morrison was building their defense case. He'd hired a team of experts, including a surveyor who specialized in disputed property lines and a forensic accountant who was investigating the financial records of the Park Service in that area. We're finding some very interesting things, Morrison told Thomas during one of their meetings. That ranger who arrested you, Dave Collins, has been living well above his government salary. New truck, expensive hunting equipment, vacations to places like Montana and Wyoming. What does that mean? Thomas asked. It might mean he's getting money from somewhere else. We're looking into whether he's been taking payments from people who want special access to hunt on federal land. The pieces were starting to come together, but Thomas knew they still had to prove everything in court. As the trial date got closer, he found himself relying more and more on Victoria's visits and Morrison's expertise. One evening, Victoria brought dinner from a restaurant in town and they ate together in the jail meeting room. It felt strangely normal, like they were an old married couple sharing a meal and talking about their day. Thomas, Victoria said as they finished eating, I need to ask you something important. When this trial starts, there are going to be reporters and probably television cameras. People are going to be very interested in our relationship. Thomas nodded. He'd been thinking about this too. We need to be consistent in our story about being married. That means we should know basic things about each other. Things a married couple would know. So Victoria began teaching Thomas about her life over the past 20 years, and she asked him detailed questions about his time on the mountain. They shared stories, memories, and dreams until Thomas began to feel like he really did know this woman well. By the time the trial was ready to begin, Thomas realized that somewhere along the way, pretending to be married to Victoria had started to feel less like pretending and more like something he wished could be real. The trial began on a cold Monday morning in March. Thomas wore the only suit he owned, which Victoria had bought for him since his old clothes weren't suitable for court. The courtroom was packed with reporters, local residents, and people who were curious about the mountain man's case. Morrison had prepared Thomas well for this day. "Remember," he'd said, "tell the truth simply and clearly. Don't try to sound like a lawyer. Just be yourself." The prosecution went first, and their case seemed strong at the beginning. They showed the court the government survey map that clearly placed Thomas's hunting spot inside the federal park. They presented photos of the elk meat found in his cabin and testified that his rifle had been recently fired. Dave Collins, the ranger who had arrested Thomas, took the witness stand wearing his crisp green uniform. He spoke confidently about finding evidence of illegal hunting and explained how the government survey proved Thomas had been hunting on federal land. "Mr. Whitmore showed no remorse when we arrested him," Collins testified. "He seemed to think he had a right to hunt wherever he wanted, regardless of federal law." Thomas felt angry listening to Collins twist the story. But Morrison had warned him to stay calm no matter what the prosecution said. When it was Morrison's turn to cross-examine Collins, things got interesting. Morrison approached the witness stand with a folder full of documents in a calm, professional manner that somehow seemed threatening. "Ranger Collins," Morrison began, "you've been with the Park Service for 2 years, correct?" "That's right. And before that you worked for Blackwater Security Services?" Collins shifted uncomfortably. "Yes, but I don't see how that's relevant. We'll get to that. Tell me, what training do you have in land surveying?" "I received basic training as part of my Park Service orientation." Morrison smiled. "Basic training, I see. Are you qualified to verify the accuracy of survey markers?" Collins hesitated. "I can read survey maps." "That's not what I asked. Are you qualified to verify survey markers?" "No, but the map I used was prepared by qualified surveyors." Morrison walked to his table and picked up a document. "This is the survey map you used to determine that Mr. Whitmore was hunting on federal land. Do you see your signature at the bottom?" "Yes. You signed off on this survey, certifying its accuracy, even though you're not qualified to verify survey markers." The prosecutor objected, but Judge Martinez allowed the question. Collins looked uncomfortable as he answered, "I was told to sign it by my supervisor." Morrison spent the next hour picking apart Collins's testimony, showing that the ranger had made several assumptions without proper investigation. By the time Morrison was finished, Collins looked nervous and unsure of himself. The real breakthrough came when Morrison called his own expert witnesses. The independent surveyor he'd hired, Dr. Patricia Wong, took the stand with a large display board showing detailed maps of Thomas's property. After conducting a thorough survey of the area, Dr. Wong testified, "I found significant errors in the government map used to, prosecute Mr. Whitmore. The actual property lines are approximately half a mile different from what's shown on the prosecution's map." She pointed to the display board. "The location where Mr. Whitmore hunted the elk in question is clearly within his private property boundaries, not on federal land." The courtroom buzzed with whispers. Thomas felt Victoria squeeze his hand under the table. For the first time since this nightmare began, he felt like he might actually win. But Morrison wasn't finished. He called his second expert witness, a forensic accountant named Robert Kim. "Mr. Kim," Morrison said, "did you conduct an investigation into Ranger Collins's financial records?" "Yes, I did. With proper court authorization, of course." "What did you find?" Kim opened his laptop and projected financial records onto a screen for the jury to see. "Over the past 2 years, Ranger Collins has deposited significantly more money into his bank accounts than his government salary would account for." The prosecutor objected, but Judge Martinez was clearly interested in hearing this testimony. Kim continued, "These extra deposits coincide with dates when expensive hunting guides brought wealthy clients to the area, near Mr. Whitmore's property." Morrison walked closer to the jury. "Are you suggesting that Ranger Collins was taking money from hunting guides?" "The evidence suggests that possibility, yes." The courtroom erupted in surprised voices. Judge Martinez banged her gavel for order. Thomas couldn't believe what he was hearing. Could Collins really have been corrupt? Morrison called his final witness, a hunting guide named Larry Peterson who worked in the area. Peterson looked nervous as he took the oath. "Mr. Peterson," Morrison said, "have you ever paid Ranger Collins for special access to federal hunting areas?" Peterson glanced around the courtroom nervously. "I want to make it clear that I had no choice. Collins approached me, not the other way around. Just answer the question, please." "Yes, I paid him." $500 each time I brought clients to hunt in that area. The prosecutor was on his feet objecting, but the damage was done. The jury had heard that Collins was taking bribes from hunting guides. And when Mr. Whitmore was arrested, Morrison continued, "Did Ranger Collins say anything to you about it?" Peterson hesitated. He said it would take the heat off his operation, that prosecuting a local guy would make it look like he was doing his job properly. Thomas felt sick to his stomach. He'd been arrested not because he'd done anything wrong, but because a corrupt ranger needed a scapegoat to cover his own crimes. The prosecution tried to recover during their rebuttal, but the evidence was overwhelming. Collins had been taking bribes, the survey map was wrong, and Thomas had been hunting legally on his own property all along. However, as the trial neared its end, the prosecutor focused on a different issue entirely. During closing arguments, he questioned the legitimacy of Thomas and Victoria's marriage. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," the prosecutor said, "we have a defendant who suddenly has the best legal representation money can buy, paid for by a woman who claims to be his wife. But look at the evidence of this supposed marriage." He held up the photos Victoria had provided. "These photos are 20 years old. These two people haven't seen each other in decades, yet we're supposed to believe they're married." The prosecutor paced in front of the jury. "I suggest that this entire marriage claim is fabricated, designed to allow Ms. Ashford to fund this expensive defense. If that's true, then both Mr. Whitmore and Ms. Ashford have committed perjury in this courtroom." Thomas felt his chest tighten. Even if they proved his innocence on the hunting charges, he and Victoria could still face serious legal trouble for lying about their marriage. Victoria sat perfectly still beside him, but Thomas could see the worry in her eyes. They had solved one problem only to create another. The prosecutor was right. Their marriage claim could be proven false, and that would mean new criminal charges for both of them. As the jury left to deliberate, Morrison tried to reassure them. "The hunting charges will be dismissed, I'm confident of that. But we may have a problem with the marriage issue." Thomas looked at Victoria, feeling guilty that he'd gotten her into this mess. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "You were just trying to help me, and now you might go to jail too." Victoria shook her head. "I knew the risks when I made that claim. I thought it was worth it to save an innocent man from prison." But as they waited for the jury's verdict, both Thomas and Victoria knew that their legal troubles might just be beginning. The truth about Collins's corruption had freed Thomas from the hunting charges, but it had also exposed the lie that had made his defense possible. The irony wasn't lost on Thomas. Just when he thought he might get his freedom back, he realized he might lose it again, and this time he'd drag Victoria down with him. The jury was out for 3 hours, which felt like 3 days to Thomas. He sat in the courthouse hallway with Victoria, both of them knowing that while they would probably win on the hunting charges, the marriage fraud issue hung over them like a dark cloud. Victoria had been quiet since the prosecutor's closing argument. Thomas could see she was thinking hard about something, and he was afraid he knew what it was. "Victoria," he said quietly, "you don't have to protect me anymore. When the jury comes back, maybe you should tell the truth about the marriage thing. Say I forced you to lie or something." She turned to look at him with surprise. "I would never do that. But you could go to jail for perjury. You have a business, a life, a reputation. I'm nobody special. It's not worth risking everything for me." Victoria was quiet for a long moment, then she said something that surprised him. "Do you know why I really came to that courtroom the first day?" Thomas shook his head. "I saw a news report about your case on television. They showed a picture of you being arrested, and you looked exactly like someone I used to know in Alaska. But it wasn't just that you looked the same, it was the expression on your face." She paused, remembering. "In that picture, you looked lost and alone, just like you did 20 years ago when I first met you in Anchorage. You were trying to be strong, but I could see you were scared and had nobody to help you." Thomas remembered those days in Alaska when he'd been young, broke, and far from home. "You helped me then too. Let me stay in your apartment. Shared your food even though you barely had enough for yourself. You helped me just as much," Victoria said. "You made me feel less alone in a scary place. And when I saw you in that courtroom, I realized I'd been alone ever since." Before Thomas could respond, the bailiff came out and announced that the jury had reached a verdict. Thomas felt his stomach drop as they walked back into the courtroom. Judge Martinez called for order as the jury foreman stood up. "Have you reached a verdict on all charges?" "We have, Your Honor." On the charge of illegal hunting on federal property, how do you find? Not guilty. Thomas felt Victoria grab his hand as relief washed over him. The hunting charges were dismissed. But everyone in the courtroom knew that wasn't the end of the story. Judge Martinez looked serious as she addressed the court. While the jury has found Mr. Whitmore not guilty of the hunting charges, there remains the matter of potential perjury regarding the marriage claim made by Ms. Ashford. The prosecutor stood up. Your Honor, the state intends to investigate this matter fully and may bring additional charges. Thomas felt sick. Just when he thought this nightmare was over, a new one was beginning. And this time, Victoria would suffer because of her kindness to him. Then something unexpected happened. Victoria stood up, her face pale but determined. Your Honor, she said in a clear voice, I need to make a statement to the court. Judge Martinez nodded. You may proceed, Ms. Ashford. Victoria took a deep breath. Your Honor, it's true that Thomas and I haven't seen each other in 20 years. It's also true that the documentation I provided about our common-law marriage was exaggerated. Thomas felt his heart pounding. She was confessing to perjury in open court. Victoria continued. I came to this courtroom because I believed an innocent man was being railroaded by a corrupt system. I was willing to say whatever was necessary to get him proper legal representation. The courtroom was dead silent. Even the reporters had stopped typing. I'm prepared to face whatever consequences come from my deception, but I want this court to know that I don't regret trying to help someone who needed help. Judge Martinez looked at Victoria with an expression Thomas couldn't read. Ms. Ashford, do you understand that you've just confessed to perjury in my courtroom? Yes, Your Honor. And you're willing to accept the legal consequences of that confession? Yes, Your Honor. Thomas couldn't stand it anymore. He jumped to his feet, ignoring Morrison's attempts to pull him back down. Your Honor, Thomas said, his voice shaking with emotion. Victoria shouldn't be punished for trying to help me. She's the kindest, most generous person I've ever known. If anyone should face consequences, it should be me. Judge Martinez looked at him sternly. Mr. Whitmore, you're not authorized to speak. I know, Thomas said, but I have to say this. Victoria risked everything to help a man she barely remembered from 20 years ago. She could have ignored my case and gone on with her successful life. Instead, she chose to help someone who couldn't help himself. Thomas looked directly at Victoria, speaking from his heart. In these past few weeks getting to know you again, I've realized something. Maybe we weren't really married 20 years ago, but I wish we had been. And if you'll have me, I'd like us to be married for real. The courtroom erupted in surprised voices. Victoria stared at Thomas with tears in her eyes. Looking shocked. Thomas, she whispered, you don't have to do this just to protect me. I'm not doing it to protect you, Thomas said, his voice getting stronger. I'm doing it because somewhere along the way, while we were pretending to be married, I fell in love with you for real. He turned back to Judge Martinez. Your Honor, I know this is unusual, but I'm asking Victoria Ashford to marry me right here, right now. If she says yes, then our marriage claim won't be a lie anymore. Victoria was crying now, but she was also smiling. Thomas, are you serious? I've never been more serious about anything in my life. You saved me, Victoria. Not just from jail, but from a lonely life where I thought I didn't need anyone. You showed me what it's like to have someone care about what happens to me. Victoria stood up and faced him. Yes, she said loudly enough for the whole courtroom to hear. Yes, I'll marry you. Judge Martinez banged her gavel as the courtroom broke into applause and excited chatter. Order, order in my courtroom. When things quieted down, the judge looked at Thomas and Victoria with what might have been the beginning of a smile. This is highly irregular, she said. But as it happens, I am qualified to perform marriages in this state. Mr. Morrison, do you have marriage license paperwork available? Morrison, who looked as surprised as everyone else, nodded. I can have the proper documents here within an hour, Your Honor. Judge Martinez thought for a moment. Very well. Court will recess for 1 hour. When we reconvene, if Ms. Ashford and Mr. Whitmore still wish to proceed, and if all the legal requirements are met, I'll perform the ceremony. As people filed out of the courtroom, Thomas and Victoria stood looking at each other, hardly believing what had just happened. Are you sure about this? Victoria asked. Marriage is a big step, especially for someone who's lived alone for 15 years. Thomas took her hands in his. I've never been more sure of anything. These past weeks, getting to know you, learning about your life, sharing my story with you, It's been the best time I've had since I moved to the mountains. Victoria smiled through her tears. I feel the same way. But Thomas, our lives are so different. You love the mountains and I have my business in the city. We'll figure it out, Thomas said. People who love each other find ways to make things work. An hour later, they stood before Judge Martinez again, this time as a bride and groom. Victoria had changed into a simple white dress she'd bought at a shop across from the courthouse, and Thomas wore his court suit with a flower from the courthouse garden in his lapel. The ceremony was simple and quick, but when Judge Martinez pronounced them husband and wife, Thomas felt like his heart might burst with happiness. He kissed Victoria in front of a courtroom full of strangers, reporters, and the corrupt ranger who had inadvertently brought them together. As they walked out of the courthouse as a married couple, Thomas realized that sometimes the most unexpected turns in life led to the most beautiful destinations. The first few months of marriage were unlike anything either Thomas or Victoria had expected. The media attention from their unusual courthouse wedding had been intense but brief. News crews had followed them for a few weeks, fascinated by the story of the mountain man and the businesswoman, but eventually other stories took their place in the headlines. Thomas was finally free to return to his mountain cabin, but everything felt different now. For the first time in 15 years, he wasn't alone. Victoria had taken a leave of absence from her consulting business to spend time with him, trying to understand the life he'd built in the wilderness. The first time Victoria saw Thomas's cabin, she stood in the doorway for a long moment, taking it all in. The one-room structure was simple but well-built, with a stone fireplace, handmade furniture, and windows that looked out over a valley that stretched for miles. Everything was neat and organized, showing the care Thomas had put into creating his home. "It's beautiful," she said, and Thomas could tell she meant it. "It's not much compared to what you're used to," Thomas replied, suddenly feeling self-conscious about his simple lifestyle. Victoria set down her suitcase and walked to the window. "Thomas, I've lived in expensive houses and stayed in 5-star hotels around the world, but I've never been anywhere that felt as peaceful as this." Those first weeks were an adjustment for both of them. Victoria had to learn to live without constant internet access, regular hot showers, and the conveniences of city life. Thomas had to get used to sharing his space and making decisions with another person. Victoria struggled with some aspects of mountain life. The first time Thomas showed her how to chop wood, she got blisters on her hands within 10 minutes. When he taught her to fish in the stream behind the cabin, she was squeamish about baiting the hook. But she kept trying, determined to understand the world her husband loved. "I feel so useless," she said one evening after failing to start a fire in the fireplace. "You can do everything: hunt, fish, build things, fix things. All I know how to do is sit in meetings and make spreadsheets." Thomas put his arm around her. "You saved my life, Victoria. You risked everything to help someone you barely knew. That's not useless. That's the most important thing anyone's ever done for me." Slowly, Victoria began to find her place in Thomas's world. She discovered she had a talent for growing vegetables in his small garden. Her organized mind helped Thomas improve his systems for storing food and managing his resources. And her business experience gave her ideas for ways Thomas could make his mountain life more sustainable. "You know," she said one morning while they were working in the garden together, "you could probably make good money as a wilderness guide. Teach people how to live off the land, show them how to hunt and fish properly." Thomas had never thought of his skills as something people might pay to learn. "You think people would be interested in that?" "Are you kidding? Half the executives I know in Denver are stressed out and dreaming of escaping to a simpler life. They'd pay thousands to spend a weekend learning what you know." But the biggest changes weren't practical ones, they were emotional. Thomas had lived alone for so long that he'd forgotten what it was like to have someone care about his daily life. Victoria wanted to know about his day, his thoughts, his dreams for the future. She listened to his stories about the animals he'd observed and the changes he'd seen in the mountain environment over the years. Victoria, meanwhile, began to relax in ways she hadn't in years. The constant pressure to be successful, to make more money, to climb higher in the business world. All of that felt less important when she was sitting by a campfire with Thomas, watching the stars come out over the mountains. "I haven't thought about my email in 3 days, she told Thomas one evening. 3 days? Do you know how impossible that would have seemed 6 months ago? Do you miss it?" Thomas asked. "The business world, I mean." Victoria considered the question carefully. I miss parts of it. I miss solving complex problems and building things that matter. But I don't miss the stress, the politics, the feeling that I was always competing with everyone around me. They developed new routines together. Morning coffee on the porch while watching the sunrise. Long walks through the forest where Thomas pointed out animal tracks, and Victoria asked 1,000 questions about everything they saw. Evenings by the fire where Victoria told Thomas about places she'd traveled, and Thomas shared stories about his years alone on the mountain. Victoria also began to understand why Thomas had chosen this life. One morning they were awakened by the sound of elk grazing in the meadow near the cabin. Victoria watched through the window as a magnificent bull elk led his herd across the clearing, stopping occasionally to look directly at the cabin as if acknowledging their presence. "He's not afraid of us," Victoria whispered. "They know I'm not a threat," Thomas explained. "After 15 years we have an understanding. I'm part of their environment now, not an intruder." Victoria felt tears in her eyes as she watched the elk move gracefully through the morning mist. She finally understood what Thomas had found in this place, a sense of belonging, of being part of something larger than himself. As spring turned to summer, Victoria began to split her time between the mountain and Denver, gradually transitioning her business to a model that would allow her to work remotely. She kept her apartment in the city for when business required her presence, but the cabin became her real home. Thomas, meanwhile, began to develop the wilderness guide service Victoria had suggested. Word spread through Denver's business community about the mountain man who could teach city people how to survive in the wilderness. Soon, Thomas was booking weekend workshops for small groups of executives who wanted to learn basic survival skills and experience a simpler way of life. "You're a natural teacher," Victoria told him after watching him demonstrate fire-starting techniques to a group of lawyers from Denver. "You explain things so clearly and you're so patient with people who don't know anything about the outdoors." The guide service was successful beyond their expectations. Thomas enjoyed sharing his knowledge with others, and Victoria handled the business side, managing bookings and marketing. They made a good team, combining his expertise with her business skills. But more than the professional success, Thomas was amazed by how marriage had changed his daily experience of life. Having someone to share his thoughts with, someone who cared about his well-being, someone who was excited to be part of his world, it made everything richer and more meaningful. "I used to think I was complete by myself," he told Victoria one evening as they sat on the porch watching the sunset. "I thought needing other people was a weakness. What do you think now?" Victoria asked. Thomas took her hand. "Now I think I was only living half a life before I met you. I had the mountains, the animals, the peace and quiet, but I didn't have anyone to share it with. Sharing it makes everything better." Victoria squeezed his hand. "I know what you mean. I had success, money, travel, everything I thought I wanted, but I was lonely every single day. I just didn't admit it to myself." As their first summer together came to an end, both Thomas and Victoria knew they had found something special. Their marriage had started as a desperate legal strategy, but it had grown into something real and deep and permanent. They had learned to bridge two very different worlds: his love of wilderness and solitude, her drive for achievement and connection to the broader world. Together, they had created a life that honored both of their needs and dreams. Looking back, Thomas sometimes marveled at the chain of events that had brought them together. If he hadn't been falsely accused of poaching, if Victoria hadn't seen his story on the news, if she hadn't been brave enough to walk into that courtroom with an outrageous lie, none of this would have happened. Sometimes the most beautiful love stories, Thomas realized, began with the most unexpected circumstances. 1 year after their spontaneous courthouse wedding, Thomas and Victoria decided to have a real celebration of their marriage. This time they chose the setting carefully, the highest meadow on Thomas's property, overlooking the valley where his journey to freedom and love had begun. The wedding was small, but perfect. A handful of close friends, including Bill Morrison, the lawyer who had become like family to them. Judge Martinez agreed to perform the ceremony again, this time in her casual clothes rather than judicial robes. Even Dr. Wong, the surveyor whose testimony had helped free Thomas, came with her family to celebrate. Victoria wore a simple white dress that could handle mountain terrain, and Thomas had invested in his first new suit in 20 years. But the most meaningful part of their outfits was what they wore around their necks. matching pendants carved from wood Thomas had taken from his original cabin, shaped by Victoria's hands during her first winter on the mountain. "Friends," Judge Martinez said as the small group gathered in the meadow, "we're here to celebrate something unusual and beautiful. A year ago, I witnessed Thomas and Victoria marry in my courtroom under extraordinary circumstances. Today, we celebrate the real love that grew from that desperate beginning." The ceremony was interrupted by the arrival of unexpected guests, the elk herd that often grazed in this meadow. The magnificent animals stood at the edge of the gathering, watching the proceedings with quiet dignity, as if they too understood this was a special occasion. "Even the wildlife approves," Judge Martinez said with a smile, continuing with the vows Thomas and Victoria had written for each other. Thomas spoke first, his voice carrying clearly across the mountain air. "Victoria, a year ago you saved my life when you walked into that courtroom. But what you really saved was my future. You showed me that living alone wasn't the same as living fully. You taught me that sharing my world with someone I love doesn't make me weaker. It makes everything stronger and more meaningful." He paused, looking out over the valley they both now called home. "I promise to keep learning from you, to keep growing with you, and to never take for granted the gift of having someone who loves me exactly as I am." Victoria's vows brought tears to the eyes of everyone present. "Thomas, when I first saw you in that courthouse, I thought I was helping a stranger. I had no idea I was meeting the person who would teach me what home really means. You showed me that success isn't about how much money you make or how many people know your name. Success is about finding peace with yourself and sharing that peace with someone you love." She looked at their small cabin visible in the distance below. "I promise to keep building this life with you, to keep learning to live simply and truly, and to always remember that the best adventures are the ones we take together." Judge Martinez pronounced them husband and wife for the second time, and this kiss was even more meaningful than the first. When they broke apart, the small crowd erupted in applause, and the elk, as if on cue, began moving across the meadow behind them like a benediction from the natural world Thomas loved so much. The celebration dinner was held on the cabin's extended porch, which Thomas had built specifically for occasions when Victoria's city friends came to visit. The meal was a perfect blend of their two worlds: fresh trout Thomas had caught that morning, vegetables from Victoria's expanded garden, and a wedding cake that had been carefully transported up the mountain by their catering friends from town. Bill Morrison stood up to give a toast. "I've been practicing law for 30 years, and I've never seen a case that ended with a wedding. Thomas and Victoria, you've shown all of us that sometimes the most beautiful outcomes come from the most challenging beginnings. Here's to love that grows stronger under pressure and partnerships that make both people better than they were alone." As the sun set over the mountains, Thomas and Victoria's guests gradually departed, leaving the newlyweds alone under a sky full of stars. They sat on their porch swing, Victoria's head on Thomas's shoulder, both of them reflecting on the incredible year that had brought them to this moment. "Do you ever miss your old life?" Thomas asked. "The business dinners, the travel, all the excitement of the corporate world?" Victoria considered the question, as she always did when Thomas asked something important. "I miss some parts of it. I miss solving complex problems and building things that impact lots of people. But I've found ways to do that here too, just on a different scale." She was right. Their wilderness guide service had grown into something neither of them had expected. Victoria had developed a program that brought troubled teenagers from Denver to spend time on the mountain, learning outdoor skills, and finding confidence they couldn't develop in the city. Thomas worked with these young people, teaching them not just survival techniques but also the patience and self-reliance that came from living close to nature. They'd also started a small business selling handmade furniture Thomas created during the winter months, marketed through Victoria's business connections. The combination of his craftsmanship and her marketing skills had created a waiting list of customers who wanted authentic, mountain-made pieces for their homes. "What about you?" Victoria asked. "Do you ever miss the solitude? Having the mountains all to yourself?" Thomas smiled. "I thought I would, but I don't. Sharing this place with you makes it better, not worse. And sharing it with the people we bring up here through the guide service, that makes it even more meaningful." He gestured toward the valley below, where the lights of the small town twinkled in the distance. "I used to think that people were the problem, that they would ruin the peace I found up here. But the right people, people like you, like some of our guests, They don't ruin it. They help me see it with fresh eyes. As their second year of marriage progressed, Thomas and Victoria continued to find new ways to blend their different strengths and backgrounds. Victoria had restructured her consulting business to focus on helping companies develop more sustainable practices. Work she could do partially from the mountain using satellite internet Thomas had finally agreed to install. Thomas, meanwhile, had begun writing a book about wilderness living, encouraged by Victoria, who had watched him patiently explain complex outdoor skills to hundreds of weekend visitors. The book project excited him because it was a way to share his knowledge with people he might never meet in person. "You have so much wisdom," Victoria told him, as she edited his first few chapters. "Not just about surviving in the wilderness, but about finding peace and purpose in a simple life. People need to hear that." Their marriage had also deepened their individual relationships with the community. Thomas, who had once been seen as the strange hermit who lived on the mountain, was now recognized as a valued teacher and guide. Victoria had become involved with environmental protection efforts in their area, using her business skills to help local conservation groups become more effective. One evening in their second spring together, they were visited by Dave Collins, the corrupt ranger whose actions had initially brought them together. Collins had served 6 months in prison and lost his job with the Park Service. He came to their cabin looking nervous and ashamed. "I don't expect you to forgive me," Collins said, standing awkwardly on their porch, "but I needed to apologize for what I did. I was taking money from hunting guides, and when my supervisor started asking questions, I needed a scapegoat. You were convenient." Thomas looked at the man who had turned his life upside down, and surprisingly, he felt more pity than anger. "What are you doing now?" "Working construction in town, trying to rebuild my life and make better choices." Collins paused. "I heard about your guide service. People say you're a good teacher, that you help folks find their way in the wilderness." Victoria stepped up beside Thomas. "Would you like to stay for dinner? We have plenty." Collins looked surprised by the invitation. "I don't deserve your kindness." "Maybe not," Thomas said, "but everyone deserves a chance to start over. That's what this place gave me." That evening, sharing dinner with the man who had inadvertently brought them together, Thomas and Victoria realized how much their lives had changed. They had both learned to forgive, to see past mistakes to the possibility of redemption, and to understand that even the most difficult experiences could lead to unexpected blessings. As they said goodbye to Collins that night, Victoria took Thomas's hand. "Do you realize what just happened? We had dinner with the man who arrested you, and it felt completely natural." Thomas squeezed her hand. "A year ago, I was sitting in a jail cell thinking my life was over. Tonight, I cooked dinner for the man who put me there, in the home I share with the woman I love." "Life is strange and wonderful, and unpredictable," Victoria added. "The best things seem to come from the places you least expect them." Standing on their porch under the vast mountain sky, Thomas and Victoria looked out over the life they had built together. It wasn't the life either of them had planned or expected, but it was a life that honored both of their dreams and values. They had learned that love didn't require two people to be the same. It required them to be willing to grow, to compromise, and to create something new together that was better than either could have built alone. The mountain man had found his home. Not just in the wilderness, he